Ethan Miller glanced at the rearview mirror one last time before parking the car at the house's entrance. The long dirt road behind him stretched out like a severed bridge, connecting him to a past he was determined to leave behind. Ravenwood, with its silent hills and trees swaying in the wind, seemed like an ideal refuge. The kind of place where no one would ask too many questions, where the eyes of the world wouldn't reach him. He got out of the car with a heavy sigh, staring at the facade of the house. It was larger than he remembered from the photos, with weathered wooden walls and windows that seemed darkened, even under the afternoon sun. A cold wind swept past him, carrying the smell of wet leaves and something metallic. It was probably just his imagination, of course. Ethan had bought the house with a quiet hope that the isolation could fix him. After the divorce and the death of his mother in the same year, his life seemed like a series of failures he couldn't stop replaying. But here, maybe, the silence would be enough to fill the empty spaces his guilt wouldn't let rest. He entered, leaving his bags in the living room. The interior was as faded as the exterior, with old furniture covered in dust and an air of abandonment that made him cough. Even so, there was something comforting in the stillness. He ran his fingers across the wood of a table, noticing deep marks, as if someone had scratched or carved something there. "Home, sweet home," he murmured, trying to ignore the feeling that he was being watched. As the sun disappeared below the horizon, Ethan settled into the upstairs bedroom. The creaking of the floor beneath his feet seemed louder than it should have been, echoing through the empty hallways. He plugged his phone in to charge and opened a bottle of wine. Maybe, after a while, he'd begin to like the place. Later, when the house sank into the absolute silence of the night, Ethan was awakened by a strange sound, a whisper, almost inaudible, coming from somewhere within the walls. He sat up in bed, his eyes sweeping the darkness of the room. Probably the wind, he told himself. But his voice sounded as lonely as he felt in that moment. The next morning, Ethan woke to the first rays of sunlight streaming through the dusty curtains. Despite the oppressive silence of the previous night, the day seemed promising. He decided to explore the house, now with daylight to dispel the irrational fears that darkness brought. Walking through the hallways, he noticed details he hadn't before. The walls bore marks of time, moisture stains and cracks that seemed to form almost intentional patterns. On the ground floor, he found a bookshelf covered in old books. Among forgotten novels and volumes of history, there was a leather-bound diary, its name on the cover, Richard Grayson, faded. Ethan opened it and found fragmented notes. "The house lives. It feels. It is draining me, making me relive everything I tried to bury." Another page only had the repeated phrase, "They know. They always know." A feeling of déjà vu washed over Ethan. He slammed the diary shut and tried to push the thoughts away. Maybe he was projecting his own unrest onto the place. Deciding to focus on something practical, he went down to the basement to check the house's condition. The basement was dark and damp, the smell of mildew filling the air. He lit the space with a lantern, revealing old boxes, rusty tools, and something that caught his attention. In the farthest corner, a pile of children's toys was neatly arranged, as if someone had been there recently. Among the toys was a small red truck, exactly like the one Caleb, his younger brother, used to carry everywhere when he was a child. His heart raced. He crouched down and picked up the truck. The paint was worn, but the familiar sound of the truck when he shook it was unmistakable. "This is impossible," he whispered to himself. Suddenly, a noise echoed behind him. A sound like bare feet stepping on the wooden floor. Ethan quickly turned the lantern, but there was no one there. Just the empty darkness of the basement. A chill ran down his spine. "You're imagining things?" he tried to convince himself, but the feeling of being watched was impossible to ignore. He rushed up the stairs, slamming the door behind him. That night, the whispers returned, but this time they were clearer. Ethan heard the sound of a child's laughter, soft but laden with something he couldn't identify, a melancholy or perhaps a veiled accusation. "Why did you leave me?" The words cut through the silence like a knife. He sat on the bed, his hands trembling. He recognized that voice. It was Caleb. Ethan tried to convince himself it was a dream, but the whispers continued, followed by the sound of something scratching the floor downstairs. With the lantern in hand, he went down, determined to confront whatever it was. In the living room, he found deep marks on the floorboards, as if something heavy had been dragged. In the center of the room, the small red truck he had found in the basement was now there, perfectly positioned in the middle of the room. "Do you still remember me?" Caleb's voice sounded so close that Ethan almost felt a hand on his shoulder. Ethan dropped to his knees, the truck still in his hand. The memory of Caleb flooded his mind. The afternoon he lost him. Ethan, at 16, was supposed to be looking after his brother while their parents were away. But he had gotten distracted with friends, leaving Caleb to play alone at the lake. When he finally found him, it was too late. He spent years trying to bury that day. But here, in this house, it seemed there was no escaping. Richard's diary words came back to him. "The house lives, it feels." Ethan understood now. The house seemed to amplify his pain, forcing him to relive every detail of his past. But why? Ethan couldn't sleep that night. Caleb's laughter echoed in his mind, mingled with the unsettling sound of something scraping against the walls of the house. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the image of his brother, with a pleading look, asking to be saved, asking not to be forgotten. He got up, trying to push the thoughts away, but something inside him knew he couldn't escape this. He needed to face the truth, even if that truth was painful. When dawn arrived, he went to the house's library, deciding to search for more information about Richard Grayson, the former inhabitant. The diary he had found was just the tip of the iceberg, and he felt there was more there. When he opened an old book on a shelf, a letter fell out from one of the pages. It was a letter addressed to someone named Sarah, dated many years ago. The handwriting was elegant, but the content was disturbing. "Sarah, the house is changing. I feel something inside me is being taken, drained, day by day. There's a presence here, something watching me, something that understands me, or perhaps wants me to understand. You need to leave before it's too late." The letter was signed by Richard Grayson. The last sentence made him shiver. "They're coming for me. They always come." The house, the presence, whatever was there, was not something he could simply ignore. In the following days, Ethan began to notice a strange change in the house's behavior. Every night, the whispering grew louder, becoming clearer, stronger. He wasn't sure if the house was trying to communicate with him, or if it was the weight of his guilt causing him to hear things that weren't there. But he knew there was something more in those walls, something that didn't belong to the physical world. He decided to investigate the attic, a place he hadn't explored yet. He climbed up with a lantern in hand, feeling a pressure in his chest as if the air was growing denser as he neared the stairs. The attic was dark and filled with old furniture covered with sheets. In the center of the room, however, something caught his attention. On the floor, a large antique mirror was leaning against the wall. He approached, his breath becoming heavier as he looked into the reflection. Something felt wrong. He couldn't pinpoint what, but there was a distortion, a shadow that shouldn't be there. When he moved closer, the mirror strangely illuminated, and a distorted image of Caleb appeared, with sad, empty eyes. His brother's image seemed to be staring directly at him, as if asking for help. Before he could react, the image disappeared. The mirror returned to its original state, with no explanation for what had just happened. Ethan felt his heart race. He was about to turn around when a voice whispered in his ear, "You should have saved me." That phrase, which he had already heard in dreams, now seemed to resonate in a real way. He looked around, but there was no one there. Ethan didn't know what else to do. He was becoming more convinced that there was something supernatural in the house, something tied to him, his pain and his guilt. He decided to go back to Richard Grayson's diary, searching for more clues. With each page, he saw the same theme, a struggle between the forces of the house and human emotions. Grayson, just like him, seemed to have been marked by the house, absorbing its anguish and fears, not knowing how to escape. However, one entry caught his attention. Richard wrote about an experience he had with a woman named Sarah, who had lived in the house long before him. Sarah had lost her daughter in an accident, and she believed the house had the power to bring the child's soul back, or at least keep the spirit trapped there, so she would never be forgotten. She doesn't understand. The house doesn't hold on to good memories. It retains pain, loss, guilt, and guilt never disappears. Ethan felt a weight in his chest. He had carried the guilt of Caleb's death for years, but now he understood. The house wasn't just a refuge for him. It was fed by his guilt, growing stronger each day with his regrets and failures. He had turned his back on his brother, and now, the house made him relive that failure every single moment. That night, Ethan decided it was time to confront whatever was at the heart of the house. He knew he couldn't keep running. The pain, the guilt, and the shadows had to be faced, so he locked himself in the main room and placed candles around, forming a circle. He knelt down, closed his eyes, and for the first time, spoke aloud to the house. "I know what you want from me. I know my guilt feeds you. But I can't live with it anymore. I can't carry the weight alone." Silence. Only the sound of the wind outside. Then he felt it. A presence, something enveloping him, something familiar, something bitter. The sensation of Caleb. He opened his eyes, and there, in the dim light, a figure appeared. Caleb, young, with sad eyes, staring directly at him. Ethan couldn't hold back the tears anymore. "I'm sorry, brother. I should have protected you." The figure of Caleb took a step forward, but when Ethan tried to touch him, the image disappeared, leaving only emptiness. For a moment, everything was silent. But then, he felt a light breeze, as if something was finally being released. He didn't know if he had truly seen Caleb, but a sense of relief began to fill the emptiness that guilt had left. The house seemed quieter now. The shadows were fading. The next day, Ethan woke up feeling something different. The weight that had burdened him for so long was starting to dissipate. The house, though still old and scarred, seemed more welcoming. He knew the shadows wouldn't disappear overnight, but he was finally ready to leave them behind. He took one last look at the house before heading out into the open field. The wind gently passed through the trees, and the landscape seemed to settle, as if the house was releasing its own demons. Ethan had confronted what haunted him, and now he was ready to move forward. The pain, the guilt, and the regret would still be there, but he knew that, somehow, he had taken the first step toward redemption. And maybe after all this time, he could finally find peace.